They called him the Ice King of Texas, a man whose wealth was matched only by his coldness. Harrison Wells built an empire from dust and cattle, treating everyone, from business rivals to his own staff, with the same biting frost that seemed to radiate from his very being. But behind the mansion's grand doors, Sarah Mitchell, his quiet maid of 15 years, saw glimpses of something else in the silver locket he kept hidden away. A reminder of warmth he'd traded for gold, of love lost to ambition. When Sarah disappears one night, taking nothing but that precious locket, Harrison's frozen world begins to crack. What could drive a loyal servant to steal the one thing money can't replace? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Morning light crept across the polished mahogany of Harrison Wells' desk, illuminating the leather-bound ledger that documented his growing empire. His weathered fingers traced the columns of numbers, each entry a testament to his ruthless ascent. From struggling rancher to the most feared businessman in the Texas territory. The book's worn edges spoke of countless hours spent calculating profits and foreclosures, its pages heavy with the weight of dreams, both built and broken. Sarah Mitchell moved silently through the study, her presence as familiar as the morning itself. 15 years of service had taught her the precise moment to appear with his coffee, black, no sugar, just as the sun touched the corner of his desk. She'd learned to gauge his moods by the tension in his shoulders, to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, to fade into the background like a shadow when his temper sparked. This morning, his jaw was set hard as granite as he reviewed the latest foreclosure notices. 3 more ranches would soon be added to his holdings. Sarah placed the coffee cup on its designated coaster, careful not to disturb the precise arrangement of papers before him. The china made no sound as it met the leather surface. She'd perfected that art years ago. "The Martinez family sent another letter," she said softly, placing the envelope beside the cup. It was her daily duty to sort his correspondence, to arrange it according to his exacting specifications. Personal appeals always went to the bottom of the pile, but she'd learned to mention them anyway. Sometimes, very rarely, he would show a flicker of something that might have been mercy. Harrison didn't look up. "Burn it!" His voice carried the same dry chill as the winter wind that swept across his vast acreage. If they had time to write letters, they had time to make their payments. Sarah's fingers lingered on the envelope's rough surface. Inside was a photograph. She'd felt its stiff outline, probably of the Martinez children. Maria Martinez had mentioned them when she'd come to the kitchen door yesterday, her eyes red from crying. 5 children, the youngest still cutting teeth. "Sir, they only ask for—" "Did I stutter, Miss Mitchell?" Now he did look up, his steel-grey eyes as hard as the safe where he kept his contracts. "Your sentimentality is neither required nor desired." The terms were clear. They failed to meet them. The consequences were explained in language simple, enough for even the most soft-hearted to understand. Sarah withdrew her hand, tucking it into the folds of her skirt. "Yes, sir. Will you be taking lunch in the study today?" "No. I have a meeting in town. The Cattlemen's Association needs reminding of certain financial realities." His attention returned to the ledger, dismissing her as completely as he dismissed the Martinez family's plea. She moved toward the door, her steps measured and quiet. Behind her, the scratch of his pen resumed. Another entry in the ledger, another fortune tallied, another family's fate sealed in stark black ink. But just before she closed the door, she caught his reflection in the window glass. For a moment, so brief she might have imagined it, his hand strayed to the inside pocket of his vest, where she knew he kept the silver locket. The gesture was one she'd witnessed countless times over the years, always when he thought himself alone, always after making some particularly harsh decision. His fingers would brush the hidden treasure, and something would pass across his face, like a cloud shadow crossing the prairie, gone almost before it could be named. Sarah had never seen inside the locket. In 15 years, she'd only glimpsed It twice when he'd accidentally left his vest hanging in the study, but she knew its power. It was the only thing in the mansion that Harrison Wells treated with anything approaching tenderness. As she walked back to the kitchen, the weight of the Martinez letter seemed to grow heavier in her apron pocket. She would burn it, as ordered. She always followed orders, but first she would carefully steam it open and remove the photograph. She kept a box of them now, hidden beneath the loose floorboard in her small room, faces of families whose lives had been altered by the stroke of Harrison's pen, whose stories were recorded only in the cold columns of his ledger. Sometimes, late at night, she would look at those photographs and wonder about the man who carried a locket next to his heart, while showing no evidence of having one. In the quietude of her small room, Sarah opened her worn prayer book, its pages swollen with 15 years of observations carefully penned in the margins. Each entry was a testament to time spent watching, waiting, understanding. The book had been her mother's last gift before consumption took her, and Sarah had transformed it into something more than a collection of prayers. It had become a chronicle of Harrison Wells' slow descent into coldness. The first entry, dated September 12, 1885, recorded her initial impressions. New position at Wells Ranch. The master is stern but fair. Grief hangs about him like morning mist, though he tries to hide it. Caught him watching the sunset from his study, holding something that gleamed silver in his hand. She turned the pages, years flowing past like water. The observations grew more detailed, more insightful. June 3rd, 1887. He refused the widow Collins's request for extension on her loan. But later, I found him in the stables, gentling that wild mare no one could tame. His hands were so patient, his voice so soft. Where does that tenderness go when he faces people? Sarah's finger traced a particularly detailed entry from 5 years ago. The ink had bled slightly, marked by what might have been a fallen tear. October 15th, 1890. Today I understood something about Mr. Wells. Watched him turn away the Peterson boys who came seeking work. I built this empire from nothing, he told them. Do the same. But his hand strayed to that locket, and for a moment his face showed such pain. He's not cruel because he feels nothing. He's cruel because he feels too much. The entries continued, filling every available space between printed psalms and hymns. Some were simple observations of daily routines. Others captured rare moments when Harrison's mask slipped, like the day last spring when a stallion had broken its leg in a gopher hole. Everyone expected Harrison to order the horse shot. It was the practical thing, the business-minded decision. Instead, he'd spent 3 hours in the corral, talking soft and low to the frightened animal while the veterinarian worked. He'd paid more for the horse's treatment than the animal was worth. Sarah added a new entry, her handwriting precise and measured. April 23rd, 1895. The Martinez family will lose their ranch tomorrow. He didn't even read their letter, didn't look at the picture of their children, but his fingers found the locket. Twice, while he spoke of foreclosure. The mask cracks more often now. Something's changing, or perhaps I'm finally seeing clearly what's been there all along. A man doesn't guard an empty heart so fiercely. She closed the book gently, running her palm over its cracked leather cover. Outside her window, evening painted the Texas sky in shades of amber and rose. From this vantage point, she could see Harrison walking the grounds, his customary evening ritual. His steps were measured, his bearing rigid as always. But when he reached the old oak tree near the fence line, he paused. His hand rose to his vest pocket, and even at this distance, Sarah could see the subtle softening of his shoulders. That tree had been there long before Harrison built his mansion, its branches offering shade to travelers and cowboys alike. Local legend said it had been a meeting place for lovers in years past. Sarah wondered, not for the first time, if Harrison's nightly walks took him past it by accident or design. She returned the prayer book to its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard, alongside the growing collection of family photographs. Tomorrow would bring more harsh decisions, more cold pronouncements from behind the mahogany desk. But Sarah had learned to see past the frost to the man beneath, a man who carried a silver key to his own imprisoned heart and didn't even know it. The yellowed newspaper clipping trembled in Thomas Bedford's weathered hands as he stood before Harrison's desk. 25 years ago, you were just like me, a man trying to build something from nothing. This article proves it. You worked. Alongside my father, he helped you when you were starting out. Harrison's face remained impassive as granite. Ancient history doesn't change current reality, Bedford. Your cattle operation is hemorrhaging money. The smart play is to sell to me now, while you can still walk away with something. Sarah lingered by the study door, ostensibly dusting the bookshelves. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the stark contrast between the two men, Bedford in his mud-stained boots and patched jacket, Harrison immaculate in his tailored suit. My father gave you credit when no bank would touch you. Bedford's voice cracked. He believed in you when you were nothing but a hungry kid with big dreams. Does that count for nothing? Something flickered in Harrison's eyes, a brief disturbance. In their icy depths, his hand moved unconsciously toward his vest pocket, then stopped. It counts for exactly what your father charged in interest. No more, no less. Business is business, Bedford. Sentiment is for fools and failures. Then, I guess I know which one I am. Bedford crumpled the newspaper clipping and let it fall. You've changed, Wells. There used to be a man behind those numbers in your ledger. After Bedford stormed out, Sarah moved to collect the discarded paper. As she smoothed it out, a younger Harrison stared back at her from the grainy photograph. He stood proudly beside an older man, Thomas Bedford's father, in front of a modest ranch house. The headline read, "Local Ranchers Pioneer New Breeding Program." "Burn it!" Harrison's command cut through the silence. But his voice held an unfamiliar note, something raw and ragged around the edges. Sarah tucked the clipping into her apron pocket. "Yes, sir." She turned to leave, but paused at the door. Through the window's reflection, she watched as Harrison finally gave in to the gesture he'd been fighting. His fingers found the locket, clutching it through the fabric of his vest. For the first time in 15 years, she saw him open it. The movement was so quick she almost missed it, a practiced motion born of countless private moments. But the setting sun caught the interior of the locket at just the right angle, throwing its contents into sharp relief. Sarah's breath caught. Inside was a photograph, worn at the edges from years of handling. A young woman stood beneath the old oak tree, her face bright with laughter. Her hand extended toward the photographer as if inviting them to join her. Harrison snapped the locket shut, but not before Sarah glimpsed the date scratched into its silver surface, May 15th, 1870, the same year he'd started buying up land. The same year he'd begun his transformation from struggling rancher to the Ice King of Texas. She slipped from the room as quietly as she'd entered, but her mind was racing. She'd always known the locket held power over him, but now she understood. Why? That laughing young woman, the old oak tree, the date that marked the beginning of Harrison's cold ascent to power. They were pieces of a puzzle she'd been assembling for 15 years without knowing it. The fine bone china cup shattered against the study wall, its pieces scattering like fallen stars across the polished floor. Sarah froze in the doorway, her hand still raised to knock. She'd never seen Harrison Wells lose control like this. 30 years of loyalty. Old Joe Matthews stood his ground despite the broken cup that had sailed past his head. 30 years, Mr. Wells. I helped your father build this ranch from nothing but dust and dreams, and now you're turning me out because I'm too slow? Harrison's voice held the bitter edge of a winter storm. The world doesn't pay for loyalty. Matthews, it pays for results. You can barely mount a horse anymore. Your hands shake when you mend fences. I'm running a business, not a charity. Sarah watched the old ranch hand's weathered face crumple. Joe Matthews had been there the day she arrived at the Wells mansion. He'd shown her where to find the best herbs in the kitchen garden, taught her which floorboards creaked, and how to avoid them during Harrison's afternoon meetings. More than that, he'd been the one who told her about Catherine. Your father would have... My father is dead. Harrison's words fell like hammer blows, along with his soft-headed notions about family and loyalty. You have until sundown to clear out your things from the bunkhouse. Your final wages will be waiting at the bank. Joe's gnarled hands trembled as he reached into his shirt pocket. Then you'll be wanting this back. He placed something small and round on Harrison's desk, a silver button engraved with the Wells Ranch brand. Your father gave it to me when I saved his life during that Blue Norther in '63. Said as long as I had it, I'd always have a home here. For a moment, just a moment, Harrison's mask slipped. His hand moved toward his vest pocket, toward the locket, but this time he forced it back down. Sentimentality is a luxury I cannot afford. The old man straightened his bent shoulders. No, Mr. Wells. It's a luxury you chose to throw away. He turned to leave, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor. At the door, he paused. I remember the day you lost her when Catherine— Get out! The words were barely a whisper, but they held enough venom to make even Joe Matthews step back. Sarah pressed herself against the wall as Joe shuffled past. She caught his arm, meaning to offer comfort, but he shook his head. Don't waste your kindness on me, Miss Sarah. Save it for him. Lord knows he needs it, even if he won't admit it. Through the open door, she watched Harrison pick up the silver button. For a long moment he stared at it, turning it over in his fingers. Then he wrenched open his desk drawer and threw it inside, but as he slammed the drawer shut, his elbow caught the empty cup on his desk, the mate to the one he'd thrown. It rolled, seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat, then crashed to the floor. The sound of breaking china snapped something in Sarah's mind. 15 years of watching, of gathering broken pieces, broken china, broken promises, broken lives. All those photographs hidden under her floorboard, all those careful observations in her prayer book. She thought of the laughing young woman in the locket, of the date that marked Harrison's transformation, of Joe Matthews and his silver button, of the Martinez family and their unread letter. She thought of Catherine, whose name she'd heard, whispered like a ghost's, whose memory seemed to haunt the old oak tree. And suddenly, with the clarity of breaking china, Sarah knew what she had to do. Sarah's resignation letter lay on Harrison's mahogany desk, precise and proper as everything else in his ordered world. The words were carefully chosen, respectful to a fault. I, Sarah Mitchell, hereby tender my resignation as head housekeeper of Wells Ranch, effective immediately. No explanation given, no accusations made, just the simple fact of her departure written in her steady hand. The mansion creaked around her in the midnight quiet. She knew every sound by heart now. The settling of old wood, the whisper of wind. Through imperfect window seals, the distant lowing of cattle in their pens. 15 years of pre-dawn risings had taught her the house's rhythms, its secrets, its vulnerabilities, like the fact that Harrison Wells, for all his rigid habits, had one weakness in his evening routine. After his 9 o'clock brandy, he would remove his vest, the one containing the precious locket, and hang it on the brass hook behind his study door while he reviewed the day's correspondence one final time. It was the only time the locket left his person during waking hours. Tonight, she had watched through the keyhole as he followed this routine, had counted the minutes as he sat at his desk, had heard the familiar creak of his chair as he leaned back to contemplate some financial matter, had waited, heart pounding, until the soft thud of his brandy glass hitting the desk signaled his usual moment of evening reflection. Sarah eased the study door open, moving like a shadow. The vest hung exactly where she knew it would be, the locket making a slight bulge in its inner pocket. Harrison's back was to her, his attention focused on the ledger before him. She reached for the vest with trembling fingers. I expected better of you, Miss Mitchell. Her hand froze inches from the garment, but Harrison hadn't turned around. He was speaking to the letter on his desk. In the silence that followed, Sarah didn't breathe, didn't move, became part of the darkness itself. 15 years of service ended with a letter in the night. He lifted his glass, swirled the remaining brandy. Like a thief slinking away. The irony of his words almost made her laugh, or cry. She wasn't sure which. With infinite care, her fingers closed around the vest. "I suppose I'll have to—" Harrison's voice stopped as he turned, finding only an empty doorway. The vest was already hidden behind Sarah's back as she slipped into the hallway. She didn't run. Running would make noise, would draw attention. Instead, she walked with the same measured pace she'd used for 15 years, letting muscle memory guide her feet around every creaking floorboard, every loose tile. The locket pressed against her palm through the vest's fine wool, its silver warmth seeming to burn like a brand. In her room, Sarah quickly retrieved her prayer book and the box of photographs from beneath the floorboard. She transferred the locket to her own pocket, then folded the vest neatly and placed it on her stripped bed. Everything else she left, exactly as it had been. Her few belongings still arranged on the dresser, her Sunday dress still hanging in the wardrobe. Let him think she'd simply walked away, taking nothing but his most precious possession. The back stairs led directly to the kitchen. She picked up the basket of mending she'd left there earlier, her excuse if anyone spotted her leaving. But the kitchen was empty, the house silent. Even the night guard, old Tommy Wilson, was absent from his usual post by the back door. Sarah sent up a silent prayer of thanks for Joe Matthews, who had promised to keep Tommy occupied with a game of cards in the guardhouse. Outside, the Texas night wrapped around her like a velvet cloak. The moon was just rising, painting the landscape in shades of silver and shadow. Sarah's steps carried her automatically toward the old oak tree. She paused beneath its spreading branches, drawing the locket from her pocket. The silver caught the moonlight as she opened it, revealing the laughing face that had haunted Harrison Wells for 25 years. Sarah touched the photograph gently, understanding at last the full weight of what she was stealing, not just a piece of silver and an old picture, but the last remnant of Harrison's humanity. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though whether to Harrison or Catherine or herself, she wasn't sure. Then she turned her steps toward the road that led to town, leaving behind the only home she'd known for 15 years, taking with her a heart frozen in silver and time. Harrison Wells unfolded the regional map across his desk, his fingers tracing the web of roads and trails that sprawled across the Texas territory. 15 years of watching Sarah's quiet efficiency had taught him one thing: she was no fool. She wouldn't take the obvious routes. "She must have had help," he growled, jabbing his finger at the guardhouse. Wilson was conveniently absent from his post. The ranch foreman shifted uncomfortably. Joe Matthews had him tied up in a poker. "Game, sir. Says he didn't see anything unusual." Matthews. The name came out like a curse. Of course, his last act of rebellion. Harrison's hand moved unconsciously to his vest pocket, finding only empty fabric where the locket should have been. This absence felt like a missing tooth, a void his tongue couldn't stop probing. "Should we send riders along the main roads?" the foreman asked. "Alert the sheriff." Harrison stared at the map, seeing not the inked lines, but Sarah's face as she'd served his coffee that final morning. Had there been any sign, any hint of her intentions? No law. The words surprised him as much as his foreman. "This is a private matter." Alone in his study, Harrison traced possible escape routes with a trembling finger. The stage routes were marked in red, the cattle trails in blue, the lesser-known paths dotted in faint brown lines. Sarah had spent 15 years learning the rhythm of his house. Surely she'd also learned the rhythms of the surrounding territory. His finger paused over a faint trail that led through the hills. It wound past the old Thompson place, abandoned now but once. Once it had been the home of... The thought struck him like a physical blow. Could Sarah know? Had she somehow discovered the connection? He yanked open his desk drawer, searching for the newspaper clipping Bedford had brought, the one Sarah was supposed to have burned. It wasn't there. Of course it wasn't. She'd been collecting pieces of his past like a magpie, storing away shiny fragments of memory he'd tried to bury. Dawn found him in the saddle, the map secured in his saddlebags, his best tracking horse. Beneath him, he'd changed from his usual business attire into the riding clothes he rarely wore anymore, clothes that reminded him of younger days, of wilder dreams. The old oak tree cast a long shadow across his path as he rode past. Memory ambushed him like a hidden rattler, Catherine standing beneath those branches, her laugh carrying on the morning breeze, the weight of the camera in his hands as he captured that perfect moment. The moment now stolen, carried away in silver and secrets by a woman he'd thought he knew. The trail through the hills was exactly as he remembered it, though he hadn't ridden it in 25 years. Each bend, each rocky outcrop sparked another memory he'd tried to forget. Here was where Catherine had taught him the names of wildflowers. There was where they'd sheltered from a sudden storm, planning futures that never came to be. A flash of movement caught his eye, a rabbit darting through the brush. Without thinking, his hand went to his vest pocket, seeking the familiar comfort of the locket. Its absence hit him anew, and with it came an unfamiliar sensation. Not the cold anger he'd expected, but something deeper, more painful. Sarah hadn't just stolen a piece of silver. She'd stolen his carefully constructed armor, leaving him exposed to every memory, every regret he'd locked away. With each hoofbeat, the question grew louder in his mind. What would Catherine think of the man he'd become? The old love letter fell from Harrison's saddlebag as he made camp for the night, its faded envelope worn soft as buckskin from years of handling. He hadn't meant to bring it, hadn't even remembered it was there, tucked away in the bag he rarely used. But now, in the flickering light of his campfire, Catherine's handwriting called to him like a voice from the past. "My dearest Harrison," the letter began, and suddenly he was 25 again, full of dreams and determination, reading these words for the first time. "Father says I'm being foolish, that a Thompson shouldn't marry beneath her station. But what does he know of stations? He measures worth in acres and bloodlines, while I measure it in the calluses on your hands, in the way you gentle that wild stallion no one else can touch, in the dreams you whisper to me beneath our oak tree." Harrison's hands trembled as he read on, the years falling away like autumn leaves. Catherine Thompson, the daughter of the wealthiest rancher in the territory, the girl who'd loved him when he was nothing but a hired hand with ambitious plans. The woman who'd believed in him when no one else would. "I don't care that you haven't got 2 coins to rub together," the letter continued. "Money's just a tool, you always say, and I believe in the man wielding it more than the money itself. Father can keep his fortune. We'll build our own, you and I, the right way, with honesty and hard work and kindness." The campfire popped, sending sparks into the night sky. Harrison looked up, his eyes burning. How young they'd been, how naive. Catherine with her dreams of honest fortunes, him with his schemes and ambitions. She'd never understood that kindness. It was a luxury poor men couldn't afford. The memory rose unbidden, the day everything changed. Old man Thompson standing in his study, face purple with rage, waving proof of Harrison's secret land deals, his under-the-table arrangements with the railroad. "You think I'd let my daughter marry a snake?" he'd thundered, "a man who'd trick honest farmers out of their land." Harrison had stood his ground, proud even then. "The world doesn't reward honest men, sir. It rewards the clever ones. The ones willing to do what needs doing. And what about Catherine? Does she know how you're building this fortune you've promised her?" She hadn't known. He'd kept that part of himself hidden, showing her only what she wanted to see, the hard-working cowboy, the gentle horse trainer, the man with dreams of making something of himself, not the man who'd already begun learning the cold arithmetic of power. The letter's final paragraph caught the firelight. "Meet me at sunset, beneath the oak tree. Bring the camera, you know, the one Papa gave you for Christmas. I want to capture this moment, this perfect time before everything changes. Because it will change, my love. We're going to build something wonderful together." They'd taken the photograph that evening, Catherine laughing, reaching for him as always. The next day, her father had shown her the proof of Harrison's dealings, He'd waited under the oak tree until midnight, the camera heavy in his hands, but she never came. Only a note, tear-stained and final. "You're not the man I thought you were." He'd thrown away the camera, but he'd kept the photograph, sealed it in the silver locket that had been his mother's last gift. A reminder not of love, but of weakness, of how feelings could blind a man to the harsh realities of building an empire. Now, watching the fire cast shadows like memories across the Texas hills, Harrison felt the weight of years and choices bearing down like a winter storm. Sarah hadn't just stolen a locket, she'd stolen the walls he'd built around these memories, forcing him to face them raw and unguarded. Harrison's father's saddle creaked beneath him, its worn leather telling stories with every movement. He hadn't used this saddle in years, preferring newer, finer equipment that befitted his station. But something about this pursuit had called for the old ways, for the tools that remembered who he'd been before wealth and power reshaped him. The morning sun painted the hills in shades of gold and shadow as he followed Sarah's trail. She was clever, he had to admit. She'd stuck to rocky ground where hoofprints wouldn't show, used streambeds to throw off tracking. But Harrison knew these lands too well. He'd built his empire by knowing every fold and wrinkle of the Texas territory. "You're getting soft, Wells," a familiar voice called out. Harrison reined his horse to a stop, finding old Jack Murphy leaning on his fence post. The weathered rancher had been one of his first neighbors back when Harrison was just starting out. "Murphy," Harrison nodded stiffly. "Seen anyone pass through recently?" Jack's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "Might have, might not have. Depends on who's asking. The boy who used to help me mend fences for 2 bits a day, or the man who tried to foreclose on my ranch last spring." The words stung more than they should have. Harrison remembered those fence-mending days, the satisfaction of honest work, the simple pleasure of Jack's wife's lemonade in the shade. That was business, Murphy. Nothing personal. Everything's impersonal, son. That's what you never learned. Jack straightened up, joints creaking like the old saddle. "Your maid stopped here yesterday, asked for water for her horse. Funny thing, she was wearing a silver locket that reminded me of something your mother used to wear." Harrison's hand went automatically to his empty vest pocket. "You knew my mother's locket?" "Course I did. Remember the day she gave it to you, right after your pa's funeral. Said it was for the woman you'd love enough to trust with your heart." Jack's eyes held a knowing gleam. "Never thought you'd let a servant steal it, though." "She didn't steal it," Harrison snapped, the words surprising him. "She liberated it. That what we're calling theft these days?" But Jack's tone was gentle. "You know, your ma also said something else that day. Said every man has to choose what kind of wealthy he wants to be, rich in gold, or rich in the things gold can't buy." Harrison shifted in the old saddle, feeling its familiar grooves and wearing spots. How many choices had led him here? How many forks in the trail had he taken, always choosing the path to more power, more wealth, more control? "The girl," Jack continued. "She asked about Catherine Thompson's old place. Seemed mighty interested in the fact that it's still standing, even if nobody's lived there these 25 years. Of course, Harrison should have known Sarah would head there. She'd pieced together enough of his past to understand the significance of that abandoned homestead. But what was her game? What did she hope to accomplish by dragging his buried past into the light? "Thank you, Jack." Harrison gathered his reins, then paused. "About the foreclosure notice. Water under the bridge, son." Jack waved a gnarled hand. "Though if you're in a mood to revisit old decisions, I wouldn't say no to a bit more time on that loan." Harrison studied the old man who'd taught him so much about ranching, about life, about the unwritten codes of the frontier. When had he stopped seeing people and started seeing only entries in his ledger? "I'll have my lawyer draw up new terms," he said quietly. "More favorable ones." "Well, now," Jack's smile deepened his wrinkles. "Maybe that maid of yours stole more than just a locket, eh?" Harrison rode on, the old saddle moving with him like a second skin. Each creak and groan of the leather seemed to whisper memories, of simpler days, of choices made and paths not taken, of a young man who'd thought he could build an empire without losing his soul in the process. The wooden cross stood in a small grove of bluebonnets, weathered but well tended. Harrison dismounted slowly, his legs stiff from riding. The name carved into the wood stopped his breath. Catherine Thompson Wells. Wells. She'd taken his name. After all, in those final days, fresh flowers lay at the base of the cross, wildflowers carefully arranged. Sarah's work, no doubt. But something else caught his eye. Older bouquets, dried and faded, laid with the same careful attention. Months' worth. Years' worth. I wondered when you'd finally come. Harrison turned. Sarah stood at the edge of the grove, the silver locket gleaming in her hands. She looked different somehow, stronger, more assured than the quiet servant he'd known for 15 years. How long have you known? His voice was barely a whisper. Since the day I started working for you. Sarah moved closer to the grave, her fingers trailing over the carved letters. Catherine was my sister. The world tilted beneath Harrison's feet. He remembered Catherine mentioning a younger sister, sent away to school in the East. A sister who would have been just Sarah's age. She wrote to me about you, Sarah continued. Every week, page after page about the kind cowboy who gentled wild horses, who dreamed of building something meaningful. Her eyes met his. Then the letters stopped. When I finally came home, I found her here, in this grove where you used to meet. Harrison's knees gave way. He sank to the ground beside Catherine's grave. What happened to her? You really don't know. Sarah's voice held no accusation, only a deep sadness. After her father showed her those land deals, after she realized how you'd built your early fortune, she tried to stop you, rode out in a storm to warn the Martinez family, yes, the same Martinez family you're foreclosing on now, that their water rights were being stolen through fine print and false promises. The old saddle creaked as Harrison's horse shifted nervously, sensing its rider's distress. The fever, he whispered. They said she caught fever. She caught fever because she spent hours in the rain, trying to undo what you'd done. Trying to believe that the man she loved was still in there somewhere, beneath the hunger for wealth and power. Sarah knelt beside him, offering the locket. She married you on her deathbed, you know. Said she still believed that someday, somehow, love would thaw your frozen heart. Harrison took the locket with trembling hands. Inside, Catherine smiled up at him, eternally young, eternally hopeful. Why didn't you tell me? All these years, would it have mattered? Sarah asked gently. I came to work for you, hoping to understand, to see what my sister had seen in you. For 15 years, I watched and waited, keeping her grave, looking for glimpses of the man she'd loved. Sometimes I'd see him, in the way you gentled horses, in how your hand would stray to. This locket after every hard decision. She stood brushing grass from her skirt. I took the locket because it was time for you to face the truth, time to remember who you were before gold became your only measure of worth. Sarah's cabin lay nestled against the hillside, a humble structure wrapped in the warmth of a handmade quilt hanging by the window. The pattern was unmistakable, the same interlocking stars Harrison's mother had sewn into every blanket she'd made. He stood in the doorway, the familiar design striking a chord deep within his memories. Mother taught all the ranch women her patterns, Sarah explained, following his gaze as she stoked the fire. Including Catherine. This was one of her last projects. She gestured to the chair by the hearth, a simple wooden seat, nothing like the fine leather chairs in his study. Sit. We have much to discuss. Harrison sank into the chair, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on him. The quilt caught the firelight, each star seeming to pulse with remembered warmth. Did she suffer? At the end? Sarah's hands stilled. On the kettle, she was hanging over the fire. No, she spoke of you in those final hours. Not of what you'd done, but of what you could still become. She turned, her eyes reflecting the flames. She saw something in you that survived even her. Discovery of your deceptions. A capacity for kindness that no amount of gold could quite kill. I thought I was being practical, Harrison whispered. The world runs on money, not morals. I learned that watching my father die in debt, watching good men lose everything because they were too honest to take what they needed. And now, Sarah poured tea into rough clay cups, so different from his fine china. What has all that practicality brought you? A grand house empty of laughter? A fortune built on others' misfortunes? A heart so frozen you need a locket to remember it exists? She handed him a cup, and the warmth of it seemed to seep into his very bones. The tea's scent transported him instantly to Catherine's garden, where she'd grown the same herbs Sarah now used. 15 years, he said slowly. You watched me for 15 years. Why reveal yourself now? Sarah settled into the chair opposite him, tucking her feet beneath her skirts in a gesture so familiar it ached. How had he never noticed how much she resembled her sister? Because of Joe Matthews, she said simply. When you turned him out, I saw something break in you, a tiny crack in the ice. The same way your hand strays to the locket, your eyes kept returning to his empty place by the stables. You're remembering how to feel, Harrison, even if you don't want to. The quilt stars blurred before his eyes. What did Catherine really see in me? Before I became this, she saw a man who could gentle wild horses without breaking. In their spirit, who knew every constellation in the Texas sky and gave them new names that made her laugh, who dreamed not just of success, but of building something meaningful. Sarah leaned forward, her voice soft but intense. She saw what you could be if you learned to balance ambition with compassion. Harrison's hands tightened around the rough clay cup. It's too late to change what I've become. Is it? Sarah stood and moved to a small trunk in the corner. From it she withdrew a familiar leather ledger. Your empire's records, which I borrowed along with the locket. I've spent the night reviewing them. Do you know how many families could keep their homes with just a small adjustment to their terms? How many lives could be transformed by showing a fraction of the mercy you'd want shown to you? She placed the ledger in his lap, and Harrison stared at it as if seeing it for the first time. Not just columns of numbers, but stories, lives held in the balance of his pen strokes. I wouldn't know where to begin, he admitted. Sarah's hand touched his shoulder, gentle as a morning breeze. Begin with Joe Matthews, then the Martinez family, one act of kindness at a time, until it becomes as natural as breathing again. The package of wildflower seeds sat unopened on Harrison's desk, their simple paper wrapper a stark contrast to the polished mahogany and leather-bound ledgers. They were Catherine's favorites, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, the same flowers that still grew near her grave. Sarah had pressed them into his hand before he left her cabin, along with a gentle challenge. Start small. Remember how to nurture something besides profit. Joe Matthews looked up in surprise as Harrison's shadow fell across the porch of his modest room at the boarding house. The old ranch hand's few possessions were still packed in crates, as if he hadn't had the heart to admit this was now his home. Mr. Wells, Joe struggled to rise, his arthritic joints protesting. If this is about the silver button— Sit, Joe. Harrison's voice was rough with unfamiliar emotion. Please. He pulled the button from his vest pocket, the same pocket that had held the locket for so many years. In the morning light, the Wells Ranch brand gleamed on its surface, carrying the weight of promises made and broken. My father was right to give you this, Harrison said quietly, and I was wrong to make you return it. He held out the button, along with a folded document. Your position at the ranch is yours for life if you want it. And there's a pension. Now for when you decide it's time to rest. My father would have done no less. Joe's weathered hands trembled as he took the papers. Sir, I don't understand. Neither do I, entirely. Harrison managed a small smile. But I'm learning. There's a small cottage being built near the old oak tree. Close enough to the stables for you to check on the horses whenever you like, far enough that the walk will keep you strong. Word spread quickly through the territory. The Ice King was thawing. When the Martinez family came to clear out their ranch, they found their loan documents revised, the terms softened to something they could manage. Maria Martinez stood in Harrison's study, clutching the new papers, tears streaming down her face. "Why?" she whispered. "After all your hard words." Harrison looked past her to where Sarah stood quietly in the doorway. She'd returned to the mansion not as a servant, but as a guest, a guide on his journey back to humanity. "Because someone reminded me that true wealth isn't always counted in dollars," he said. "Your children need their home more than I need another ranch." The changes were small at first, like seeds planted in long frozen soil. Harrison found himself lingering in the stables again, gentling horses with the patience he'd once been famous. He walked the boundaries of his land, not to look for weaknesses to exploit, but to note which families might need help with their fences, their wells, their hopes. But not everyone believed in this transformation. Veteran ranchers watched with suspicious eyes, waiting for the other boot to drop. "Man doesn't change his spots this late in life," they muttered in saloons and general stores. "He's up to something, just you wait." Sarah watched it all with quiet understanding. "Change isn't a single grand gesture," she told him one evening, as they walked past the old oak tree. "It's 1,000 small choices, each one bringing you closer to the man Catherine always saw in you." Harrison knelt in the soil beneath the oak, finally opening the package of wildflower seeds. His hands, more used to counting gold than sowing hope, moved carefully through the earth. Each seed represented a promise, to his past, to his future, to the memory of a love he'd traded for power. "I don't know if I can be that man again," he admitted. Sarah knelt beside him, her fingers joining his in the dirt. "You don't have to be that man again," she said softly. "Be a better one." The foreclosure notice trembled in Harrison's hands. Its official letterhead bearing the same bank's name that had once denied him loans in his younger days. Now they were calling in markers on 36 local ranches, using the same ruthless tactics he'd perfected over the years. The drought had left families vulnerable, and the bank was moving in for the kill. "They're using your old playbook," Sarah observed quietly, reading over his shoulder in the study. "Buy low during hard times, squeeze out the smaller ranches, consolidate the holdings." Harrison's jaw tightened. "They offered to make me a partner in the venture. Said my experience in property consolidation would be valuable." The words tasted like ashes in his mouth. The bank's representative, Edwin Porter, sat across the desk, his smile as sharp as a new-minted coin. "It's a generous offer, Mr. Wells. The profits would be substantial." He patted his portfolio. "These smaller operations are dragging down land values. Together, we could reshape the entire territory. Isn't that what you've always wanted?" Harrison's hand moved to his vest pocket, finding the silver locket that Sarah had returned to him. Inside, Catherine still smiled her eternal smile. But now the photograph seemed to ask a question. "Who will you choose to be?" "I've reviewed the loan documents," Porter continued smoothly. "Most of these families won't last another month without rain. When they default, we'll be doing them a favor by taking the burden off their hands. You understand this better than anyone, Mr. Wells. It's just business. Just business." How many times had Harrison spoken those same words? How many families had he dismissed with that cold phrase? He opened his ledger, not the old one full of foreclosures and acquisitions, but the new one Sarah had helped him create. In its pages were the stories of families he'd begun to help, of loans restructured, of hope restored. His finger traced down the columns of numbers that now represented lives rather than just profits. "You're right, Mr. Porter," Harrison said slowly, rising from his chair. "I do understand this better than anyone. I understand exactly what it costs." He walked to the window, looking out at the drought-stricken land. "Which is why I'm going to have to decline your offer." "Decline?" Porter's smile faltered. "Mr. Wells, surely you—" "Furthermore," Harrison continued, turning back to face him, "I'll be purchasing those markers myself. All of them." Sarah's Sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the suddenly still room. Porter's face flushed. "That would be extremely expensive, Mr. Wells. The drought has driven land values. I don't care about land values." Harrison returned to his desk, pulling out paper and pen. "I care about people, something I learned far too late in life." He began to write, his pen scratching across the paper with purpose. "I'm offering 10% above what your bank paid. For those markers, non-negotiable." "You'd be throwing away a fortune," Porter protested. "These people, they're not worth—" "Choose your next words carefully, sir." Harrison's voice carried an echo of his old steel, but tempered now with something warmer. "Every person on this list is worth more than all the gold in your bank's vaults. I know because I once made the mistake of thinking otherwise." After Porter stormed out, clutching Harrison's bank draft like it might bite him, Sarah moved to stand beside the desk. "That was your retirement fund," she said softly. "Everything you'd set aside for your later years." Harrison touched the locket again, feeling its familiar weight. "There are better legacies than gold," he replied. Then he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Besides, I have something better than a retirement fund. I have a second chance." The repaired fence line stretched across the Martinez property like a promise kept. Harrison stood beside young Miguel Martinez, both men's hands bearing fresh blisters from the day's work. 6 weeks had passed since Harrison had bought out the bank's markers, and he'd spent every Saturday since then working alongside the families he'd once sought to displace. "My father says you're different now," Miguel said, testing the strength of a post. "Says you remind him of someone from long ago, a young rancher who used to help neighbors just because they needed it." Harrison ran his hand along the smooth wood of the fence rail. "I'd forgotten that version of myself, thought he was too weak to survive in this world." He looked across the drought-parched land, seeing not its limitations, but its possibilities. "Took a wise woman to show me he was the strongest part of me all along." Sarah appeared on the ridge above them, carrying a basket that steamed in the cool morning air. She'd taken to bringing lunch to wherever Harrison was working, though they both knew she wasn't there just to deliver food. She was watching his transformation, nurturing it like the wildflowers that had begun to bloom beneath the old oak tree. The change in Harrison was becoming visible to everyone. When the Cooper family's well ran dry, he didn't buy their land. At a discount, he brought his own men to dig them a deeper well. When Widow Jensen's cattle broke through their fence and scattered across 3 counties, his riders helped round them up without charging a fee. Each act of kindness was like mortar in a wall, slowly rebuilding connections he'd spent decades tearing down. "You showed up," Tom Cooper said one evening, as Harrison helped him prime the new well pump. "When things went bad, you showed up." "The old Harrison Wells would have sent a foreclosure notice. The old Harrison Wells was a fool," he replied, tightening a bolt. "Thought power meant having control over others. Never understood it really means having control over yourself." Word spread about small kindnesses. Harrison stopping his wagon to help children gather scattered corn, offering advice on cattle breeding to struggling ranchers, teaching young Miguel Martinez the art of gentle horse training that he'd once been famous for. The suspicious looks began to fade, replaced by cautious acceptance, but it was the day of Maria Martinez's kitchen fire that truly marked the change. Harrison had been riding past when he saw the smoke. Without hesitation, he'd rushed into the burning kitchen, emerging with Maria's youngest child in his arms, his fine coat ruined and his face streaked with soot. "You could have been killed," Sarah scolded later, tending to his burned hands with the same gentle attention she'd always shown his morning coffee. "There was a time I would have calculated the cost of the kitchen against the value of the ranch," he admitted. "Wouldn't even have thought about the child." He looked at his bandaged hands. "Now I can't imagine thinking that way." "Catherine would be proud," Sarah said softly. "She always said true wealth shows in what you give, not what you keep." Harrison touched the locket, which now hung openly around his neck. "I'm starting to understand what she meant. Every time I help someone, every fence I mend or child I teach to ride, It's like another piece of ice melting away. I feel more alive now, giving things away than I ever did hoarding them. Through the window, they could see fireflies rising from the grass, the first of the season. Their light danced like stars brought to earth, reminding Harrison of nights spent teaching Catherine the constellations. But now, watching Sarah's hands move surely over his bandages, he felt something unexpected, not just the ache of memory, but the warmth of possibility. The old ranch bell rang out across the valley, its urgent voice carrying through the worst storm Texas had seen in 20 years. Harrison stood in the driving rain, pulling the rope with a steady rhythm that echoed his father's teachings. 3 rings for help, 3 rings for hope, 3 rings for home. 2 months of drought had left the land parched and hard. Now the rain fell in savage sheets, turning creek beds into raging rivers, threatening to wash away everything in its path. From his vantage point on the mansion's highest ground, Harrison could see the lights of scattered ranches blinking through the darkness like distress signals. "The Martinez place will flood first," Sarah said, appearing beside him with armfuls of blankets. "Their land sits lowest in the valley." Harrison nodded, already calculating. Not profits now, but people. How many riders he could spare. How many families would need shelter. How much time they had before the rising waters cut off the lower roads. "Ring it again," he told Sarah, releasing the bell rope to mount his horse. "Keep ringing it, let them know where to come." He turned to Joe Matthews, who sat straight-backed on his own horse despite the storm. "Joe, take 4 men and get to the Martinez family. Miguel knows horses. Put him in charge of evacuating their stock, but people first." "Yes, sir." Joe's voice carried the same pride it had 25 years ago, when Harrison had been the one taking his orders. "What about the Cooper place?" "I'll go myself." Harrison checked his saddlebags, packed with rope and tools. "Tom's got that new baby. They'll need help fast." He looked to where his foreman waited with more mounted men. "The rest of you know. Your sectors. Remember what we practiced? Families first, then livestock if there's time. Use the high trails we marked last month." Sarah caught his arm before he could ride out. "You marked evacuation trails? When?" "After you showed me the old weather records in Catherine's journal." Harrison's face softened at her surprise. She tracked rainfall patterns for years. Noted how the valley flooded in cycles. "I should have paid attention back then. She always said knowledge was worthless without action." The bell's voice carried over the howling wind as Harrison rode into the storm. Its song was different from the day his father died, when it had told slow and solemn. Different from the day he'd turned his back on Catherine's warnings about the flood plains, letting him build his empire on land that nature had never meant for ranching. Now it rang with purpose, with promise, with redemption. Through the night, the bell guided families to safety. Harrison's mansion filled with wet, grateful people. Children wrapped in blankets by the fire, women organizing food in the kitchen, men tending to rescued livestock in the stables. The grand rooms that had echoed with lonely splendor for so many years now hummed with life and community. Harrison worked alongside everyone else, his fine clothes as mud-stained as any rancher's, his orders given not with cold authority, but with calm certainty. When the Cooper baby began crying with fever, he opened the master bedroom to the family without hesitation. When food ran low, he ordered his private storehouses opened. When old grievances threatened to flare between feuding families, crammed together in stress and fear, he settled them with the same patience he'd once used with wild horses. Dawn broke over a transformed landscape. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a world scoured clean. Fields lay underwater, fences were down, and the valley would take months to recover. But as Harrison stood on his front porch, watching the sunrise paint the floodwaters gold, he felt no despair. "We'll rebuild," he said to the gathered families. "All of us, together. I've got lumber you can use, tools you can borrow. We'll start with the Martinez place, since they're lowest, work our way up the valley." He managed a tired smile. "Consider it an investment in something more valuable than gold." Sarah appeared at his elbow with coffee, black, no sugar, just as she'd served it for 15 years. But now she stayed beside him as he drank it, her shoulder touching his, both of them watching the community already organizing itself into work parties. "You couldn't have saved all their homes," she said softly, "but you saved what mattered most. You gave them hope." Harrison touched the locket, feeling its familiar weight. "Catherine once told me a man's true character shows not in how he handles success, but in how he faces disaster." He looked at Sarah, seeing in her proud smile a reflection of her sister's faith in him. "I think I'm finally beginning to understand what she meant." The new estate documents lay spread across Harrison's desk, each page representing a piece of his transformation made legally binding. His lawyer, James Wilson, sat slack-jawed as Harrison outlined his plans. "A cooperative trust?" Wilson adjusted. His spectacles. "Mr. Wells, you're talking about giving these families partial ownership of your holdings. The very same families you spent decades, the very same families I spent decades exploiting," Harrison finished firmly. "Yes, it's time to make things right." The papers detailed a complete restructuring of the Wells empire. Grazing rights would be shared. The river water would be managed communally. Profits from the railroad contracts would help fund a school, a proper medical clinic, even a community grain storage for hard times. Catherine always said wealth was meant to flow like water, Harrison mused, watching Sarah tend to the wildflowers that now bloomed beneath his window. "Damming it up only leads to stagnation." Wilson shuffled uncomfortably. "And the bank board, they won't take kindly to this level of generosity. The bank board can go to hell." Harrison's voice carried an echo of his old steel, but tempered. "Now with purpose rather than cold ambition. I've already transferred controlling interest to the trust. They can't stop it." He lifted a particular document, the cornerstone of his new vision. The Martinez family would manage the southern pastures. The Coopers would oversee the grain storage. Joe Matthews would run the horse breeding program, teaching young riders the old ways. Each family would have a voice in the trust's decisions, their combined experience worth more than any one man's gold. "You're dismantling everything you built," Wilson protested weakly. Harrison smiled, touching the locket that now hung openly around his neck. "No, old friend, I'm building something I should have built 25 years ago, something worthy of Catherine's dreams, something that will last longer than one man's fortune." Sarah entered quietly, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. But instead of fading into the background as she once had, she pulled up a chair. Harrison had insisted she be present for this, not as a servant, but as a trustee. "Tell him about the scholarship fund," she prompted softly. Harrison's eyes lit up. "Ah, yes, Catherine's legacy fund, for promising students who need help reaching their potential." He passed another document to Wilson. "To be administered by Sarah, who has proven far wiser than I ever was about investing in people rather than profits." Wilson skimmed the papers, his expression shifting from shock to something like grudging admiration. "You've thought of everything. The legal framework is actually quite brilliant. But Mr. Wells, what about your own future, your retirement?" "My future?" Harrison glanced at Sarah, caught the gentle pride in her eyes. "My future is right here, helping build something meaningful. Besides," he allowed himself a small smile, "I've kept enough to live comfortably, just not enough to live coldly." After Wilson left, Sarah stood at the window, watching children play in the restored gardens where Harrison's private hunting grounds had once stood. Catherine would hardly recognize this place now. She would recognize the heart of it, Harrison said quietly. "She always saw what it could become, even when I was blind to everything but profit." He moved to stand beside her. "I have you to thank for that, Sarah. You and that stolen locket." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes bright with tears and something warmer. "I didn't steal your heart, Harrison Wells. I just reminded you where you'd hidden it." The wedding band glinted in Harrison's palm, his mother's simple gold ring catching the last light of sunset. He sat beneath the old oak tree, rolling the ring between his fingers as he had once fidgeted with the locket. Sarah would be coming. Soon, they had taken to meeting here each evening, sharing coffee and conversation as the day's heat faded into dusk. He touched the locket that still hung around his neck, remembering how differently it had felt when hidden in his vest pocket. A secret weight of guilt and regret. Now it lay open in his hands, Catherine's smile visible to anyone who cared to look. "I thought I'd find you here," Sarah's voice carried on the evening breeze. She settled beside him on the worn wooden bench they'd placed beneath the oaks, spreading their branches. The Martinez children were asking for another story about the old days. "Which one did you tell them?" Harrison smiled, knowing her answer before she spoke. "The one about the wild stallion no one could tame. How a young rancher spent 3 weeks just sitting in the corral, waiting for the horse to choose to trust him." She touched the locket gently. "Catherine loved that story. Said it showed who you really were underneath all the ambition." Harrison closed his fingers around his mother's ring. "I've been thinking about trust, about choices, about how sometimes the hardest part of changing isn't the big gestures, but the small daily decisions to remain changed. Like keeping the locket where everyone can see it." Sarah's eyes held understanding, instead of hiding it away. "Like letting myself feel again, even when feeling hurts." He turned to face her fully. "Sarah, I need to ask you something. About Catherine, about us." She waited, patient as always, while he found the words. "When you first came here, you wanted to understand what Catherine saw in me, to find that man she believed in." His voice roughened. "Did you find him?" "I found something better," Sarah said softly. "I found the man you're becoming. The one who's learned from his mistakes instead of hiding from them. The one who uses his strength to lift others up rather than push them down." Harrison opened his palm, revealing the ring. "I loved Catherine with all the passion and blindness of youth. Lost her because I couldn't balance that love with my ambitions." He took a deep breath. "But you've taught me a different kind of love. Slower, wiser, built on understanding and second chances." Sarah's eyes widened as she understood what he was asking. "I'm not the man Catherine loved," Harrison continued, "and you're not Catherine. We're both something different, something tempered by time and loss and healing. If you're willing, I'd like to discover what that could mean, together." Before Sarah could answer, a noise made them both turn. Miguel Martinez stood at the edge of the garden, looking embarrassed. "Sorry, Mr. Wells, Miss Sarah, but Mama sent me. The new foal. It's coming early." Harrison tucked the ring away, but not in a hidden pocket. Instead, he placed it carefully beside the locket in plain view around his neck. "Well then," he said, rising and offering Sarah his hand. "Shall we go, help bring new life into the world?" Sarah took his hand, her grip sure and warm. "Together," she said, and in that one word Harrison heard his answer. They walked toward the stables, their joined shadows stretching long across grass that had grown lush again after the floods. Behind them, the old oak tree stood witness, its branches swaying in the evening breeze, whispering secrets of past and future, of endings and new beginnings. The family portrait hung in the mansion's great hall, not hidden away in a private study, but displayed where every visitor could see it. Harrison stood at its center, but not alone, not the solitary figure of power he'd once cultivated. Sarah was beside him, her hand resting on his arm, wearing not a servant's dress, but a bride's simple elegance. Around them gathered the faces of their extended family. Joe Matthews, proud and straight-backed, the Martinez children beaming from the front row, Tom Cooper holding his now toddling son, and dozens more whose lives had become interwoven with theirs. "Your father would have loved this," Joe said, standing beside Harrison as they admired the newly hung portrait. "A proper family photo, just like he always wanted for you." Harrison touched the two treasures that hung around his neck, the silver locket and his mother's gold ring, now worn smooth by Sarah's daily touch. "He wanted me to understand that true wealth grows by sharing it," he smiled. Took me most of my life to learn that lesson. The mansion had changed, like its owner. Where once stern portraits of business associates had glared down at visitors, now children's artwork brightened the walls. The formal parlor had become a community meeting room. The library opened its doors to anyone seeking knowledge, and the kitchen always smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Sarah appeared in the doorway, carrying a familiar ledger. But now its pages held different sorts of accounts, records of shared harvests, notes on which families might need extra help through winter, plans for expanding the school come spring. The Anderson twins want to know if you'll teach them horse gentling. Tomorrow, she said, settling beside him on the window seat that overlooked the flourishing gardens. And Maria Martinez says the roses you planted on Catherine's grave are blooming. Harrison wrapped his arm around her shoulders, breathing in the contentment of a life richly lived. Through the window, he could see the old oak tree, its branches now sheltering young couples who came to share their own dreams. The wildflowers he and Sarah had planted spread in bright carpets across what had once been manicured lawns. Their untamed beauty, a testament to letting go of rigid control. Sometimes, he said quietly, I wonder what Catherine would think of all this, of us. Sarah touched the locket gently. She'd think love won. Different from what she imagined, shaped by time and trials, but love still won, she smiled. That's what she always wanted for you. Not just to be successful, but to be truly wealthy in all the ways that matter. Outside, the evening bell rang, not in warning now, but in celebration. Another wedding in the community, another bringing together of families. Harrison and Sarah walked hand in hand toward the sound, their steps sure on the path they'd chosen together. The Ice King of Texas was gone, melted away by the warmth of second chances and chosen family. In his place stood a man who had learned that the greatest power lies not in what you can take, but in what you choose to give. A man who had lost his heart, found it again, and learned to share it with an entire community. As they reached the garden gate, Harrison paused. Sarah knew without asking what he was thinking. She had grown skilled at reading his moments of reflection. Together, they looked back at the mansion, at the portrait in the window, at the life they had built from the ashes of old regrets. "Ready?" she asked, though she already knew his answer. Harrison smiled, touching the locket one last time, before letting it rest against his heart, no longer a hiding place for pain, but a reminder of love's transforming power. "Ready," he said, and together they walked toward the sound of celebration, their shadows merging in the light of the setting sun.